Here is a video that offers a quick introduction to the theory of functionalism in the philosophy of mind. Consider this to be for educational purposes only. It is not an opinionated piece. I have also written this up into a longer paper, which you can find in the description below. What is the relation between the mind and the body? Or, more specifically, what is the relation between mental states on the one hand, such as the belief that it is sunny outside, or the pain that you feel when you stub your toe, and states of the brain on the other hand, i.e., conditions on your neurons? It is often said that the answer lies within an analogy to computers. According to this popular idea, the mind is like a computer program that runs on the hardware of the brain. Just as computer programs are high-level patterns in the workings of a physical machine made out of metal and plastic, so too are mental states. They are patterns in the physical workings of the brain. However, it must be admitted that, as it stands, this idea is fairly vague. If this nascent idea is to be converted into a workable theory of the mind, then this analogy must be clarified. Functionalism, in the philosophy of mind, represents a broad family of theories that attempt to explain the nature of mental states in a way that is harmonious with the idea that they are like computer states. There are several versions of functionalism, and some of them take the computer analogy more seriously than others. But roughly speaking, each of them aims to spell out the relationship between the mind and the body by saying that mental states are abstract patterns that are implemented by physical states and processes. For us, these patterns are exhibited in our brains, but for the functionalist, a machine made out of any material could, in theory, implement the patterns that are characteristic of mental states. It is important to begin by clarifying the question that functionalism is intended to answer. To this end, we must distinguish between instances of a mental state and mental state kinds. In philosophical jargon, this is the distinction between tokens and types. Consider pain. When we speak of pain in general, we are speaking of a kind of mental state. It is a kind of mental state because it can be shared by multiple people at multiple times. I stub my toe and I experience pain. You hit your funny bone and you experience pain. In each case, there is a common kind of mental state that we both share, namely pain. Even though we share a common kind of mental state, each of us experiences our own separate instance of it. I have my instance of pain, which occurs at a particular time, and you have your instance of pain, which occurs at another particular time. So there are two instances of one kind of mental state. Since there are two instances, my pain and your pain, we may ask, what do these two instances have in common? Why do they belong to the same mental category? In short, what do instances of pain have in common that makes them describable as pain? This is the question that functionalism seeks to answer. It aims to identify the factors that unite the instances of each kind of mental state. This goes for pain, and it also goes for other mental state kinds, like itching, experiencing the color red, experiencing the color blue, believing, desiring, and so forth. Before we outline the functionalist's answer, it would be helpful to first consider a different answer from one of functionalism's main opponents. By doing so, we can then explain the functionalist position by contrast. The psychoneural identity theory is another theory in the philosophy of mind, and much like functionalism, it also attempts to say what the instances of a mental state kind have in common. The central tenet of the psychoneural identity theory is that mental states just are brain states. Mental states are literally identical to brain states, according to this view. This means, in particular, that mental state kinds are brain state kinds. Thus, According to the psychoneural identity theory, the instances of a kind of mental state must also be instances of a common kind of brain state. To illustrate this idea, philosophers often use the example of pain and C fiber stimulation. C fibers are a kind of nerve fiber located in the brain which are activated or stimulated whenever a person experiences the sensation of pain. We know that when a person is in pain, their C fibers are stimulated, and when their C fibers are not stimulated, then they do not experience pain. Anesthesia works by freezing the nerve pathways that lead to the C fibers. We thus say that C fiber stimulation is correlated with pain, at least in humans. That is, they occur together. We know this through scientific observation. The psychoneural identity theorist takes an additional philosophical step and hypothesizes that pain just is C fiber stimulation. In their view, pain and C fiber stimulation are not two different kinds of states that happen to occur together, like smoke is correlated with fire. Rather, they say that pain and C fiber stimulation are literally one and the same thing, just as water is the same as H2O. This theorist would also make similar claims about every other kind of mental state. Each mental state is conjectured to be correlated with some kind of brain state, and the identity theorists will claim that each mental state is identical to their correlated brain state. Since they claim that mental state kinds are brain state kinds, the psychoneural identity theorist offers a straightforward answer as to what the instances of a mental state kind have in common. They are instances of a common brain state. So, what do all the instances of pain have in common according to this view? The identity theorist says each instance of pain is a stimulation of C fibers. If mental states are physical states, then it follows that each mental state is united by a common physical condition. As it turns out, this last feature of the psychoneural identity theory also happens to be its greatest weakness. If pain is the same thing as C fiber stimulation, then it follows that every creature that is capable of feeling pain must possess a brain that is endowed with this specific kind of neural fiber. However, it also seems to many philosophers that this is overly restrictive. After all, there are many animals that have nervous systems that are physiologically quite different from ours, and yet they seem perfectly capable of experiencing pain. Take the octopus, for example. The fibers that make up an octopus's brain are physiologically quite distinct from the fibers that make up our brains. But despite this, it seems absurd to deny that an octopus can feel pain. We can also consider hypothetical examples. Perhaps it is possible that aliens could have evolved with non-carbon-based brains. Perhaps there could be aliens whose bodies are made of silicon. We can imagine these aliens having all of the same overt behavior as humans do. When they are pricked with a sharp object, they wince and groan and pull away from the cause of the damage. Moreover, we can further imagine that their silicon brains have mechanisms that trigger this avoidance behavior whenever they suffer surface damage. In that case, these aliens wouldn't have C fiber stimulation, since their brains are made of a different material, but it is still quite plausible to say that they have pains. Again, the problem with the psychoneural identity theory is that it implies that these aliens cannot feel pain, since their brains are made of a different material from ours. But that just seems wrong. It seems entirely possible that a silicon-based brain could give rise to instances of pain, provided that it operates in a similar fashion to our carbon-based brains. The material, or the physical and chemical composition of a creature that a creature is made of, does not seem relevant to whether it can instantiate mental states. Rather, what matters to mentality is what the states of an organism can do. At least, this is the thought that motivates functionalism. This argument against the psychoneural identity theory also has the virtue of illustrating one of the core tenets of functionalism. This is the claim that mental states are multiply realizable. By this, the functionalism means that the instances of any kind of mental state may be instantiated by many different kinds of physical states. To continue with our running example, the functionalists will say that pain can be realized by one kind of neural state in humans, i.e. C fiber stimulation, and a different kind of neural state in the octopus, and yet a different kind of physical state in aliens as well. We'll give a precise definition of realized later. If I stub my toe right now, then the pain that I feel is the product of C fiber stimulation in my brain. And if an alien stubs its toe, then according to the functionalist, the pain that it feels is the product of a different physical state. We could call it A fiber stimulation for alien fibers. So pain in humans is a matter of C fiber stimulation, and pains in aliens is a matter of A fiber stimulation. The point is, pain does not need to be identified with a single physical condition that is common to all pains, according to the functionalist. Rather, there are many different physical conditions that can give rise to pain. This is why they say that pain can be multiply realized. So if, as functionalism says, pains do not need to have any particular brain state in common, then the next natural question is, what else do they have in common that unites them together as a common kind of mental state? Here is the second major tenet of the functionalist picture. According to functionalism, mental states are defined by their function. That is, they're defined by their role within the overall system of psychological processes and bodily behaviors of an organism. To put it succinctly, mental state kinds are conceived of as functional kinds. The instances of mental states are grouped together by the common function that they perform. Before we go on to sharpen this idea, it will be helpful to see an analogy. There are many concepts that we use in everyday life that are defined in terms of a function. Take, for example, the concept of a mousetrap. What makes something a mousetrap? What do all mousetraps have in common that makes them mousetraps? Is it their physical material? Of course not. Mousetraps can be made out of metal, wood, plastic, or virtually anything else. It would be wrong, therefore, to identify this kind of artifact with something that's defined solely by its physical and chemical anatomy. Mousetraps cannot be grouped together solely by their physical properties. There must be something else besides their physical and chemical material that makes something a mousetrap. So what should we say instead? For the case of mousetraps, the answer should be obvious. The thing that all mousetraps have in common is what they do. It's not what they're made of. The thing that they have in common is that they're supposed to catch mice. That is to say, they perform a certain cause and effect pattern. They cause mice to become caught. We can think of this in terms of input and output. The input is any situation in which a mouse is present. A mousetrap's job is to transform this situation into a state in which a mouse is caught, and that would be its output. Any device that can do this job of transforming a mouse is present state into a mouse is caught state will therefore count as a mousetrap. This can be done in many different ways. Some traps are humane and allow the user to catch and release the mouse, and other traps are not humane. Provided that the device does this job in some way or another, it will thereby count as a mousetrap. Functionalists about the mind claim that similar things can be said about mental states. According to their view, each kind of mental state ought to be characterized by its function, that is, the role that it plays in transforming certain inputs into outputs. To see what this means, consider the case of pain again. In order to give a functionalist account of pain, the first step is to identify the causes and effects of pain. In this case, the typical causes of pain will include getting hit by a blunt object, getting poked by a sharp object, burning, joint inflammation, muscle tears, and so on. On the other side of the equation, the typical effects of pain will include wincing, groaning, favoring the damaged or inflamed area, desiring to get rid of its cause, becoming distressed, believing that the area is damaged, and so on. Since we're only aiming to illustrate the general idea, it's okay if we leave these lists open-ended. Once we have identified the causes and effects of pain, we are then in a position to state its function. According to functionalism, the function of pain is to be activated by its causes, so activated by tissue damage, for example, and then to bring about its typical effects, such as wincing and groaning and the desire to be rid of the pain, and so forth. This is, accordingly, what all pains have in common. They mediate between the transition from these causes to these effects. Just like a mousetrap is defined by what it does, bringing a mouse's present state into a mouse's caught state, pain, according to the functionalist, is also defined by what it does. It brings a state of tissue damage, etc., into a state of wincing and groaning and desiring to be rid of the pain, and so on. To put it succinctly, what is it for a state to be pain? For the functionalist, it is for that state to be caused by tissue damage and so on, and to bring about wincing and groaning and other pain responses. The functionalist will have similar things to say about every other mental state. If M is a mental state, then it will have its typical causes and its typical effects. M can thus be said to have the function of facilitating the transition from those causes to those effects. The functionalist's core thesis, then, is that this function essentially characterizes M as a kind of mental state. What do the instances of M have in common? For the functionalist, the answer is that each instance of M facilitates the transition from those causes to those effects. The instances of the mental state are grouped together by this common function that they perform. As you can see, a function is an abstract pattern in the causal relations exhibited by a system, and that can be a person, an animal, or a computer. We have seen how the functionalist appeals to these abstract patterns to characterize the mental state kinds. This now puts us in a position to appreciate another aspect of functionalism. We can now ask, how do mental states relate to physical states? We have already mentioned the name that the functionalist has given to this relation. They say that mental states are realized by physical states. Now that we have explained their general view, we can say what realization amounts to. Basically, for the functionalist, a kind of mental state is defined by its cause and effect pattern. For each particular organism, or non-organic system, that instantiates a mental state, M, there will be some physical state of the organism, P, that facilitates this causal process. We can say that the physical state plays the role that defines the mental state. This is what realization amounts to, according to the functionalist. When a physical state P exhibits the cause and effect pattern that defines a mental state M, then P realizes M. Once again, we have noted that for humans, C fiber stimulation is correlated with pain. The functionalist will notice that C fiber stimulation is not only correlated with pain, but it also is caused by the typical causes of pain, and it produces the typical effects. So for example, it is caused by tissue damage, and it causes wincing and groaning. For this reason, they will say that C fiber stimulation realizes pain in humans. This is consistent with pain being realized by other physical states in other systems. If we supposed that there are Martians that have non-carbon-based brains that contain a different type of circuitry, they have A fibers instead of C fibers, and these A fibers are stimulated as a result of surface damage, and they cause pain behavior like wincing and groaning, then, since they play the defining causal role of pain, it will follow, according to the functionalist, that A fiber stimulation realizes pain for these Martians. And if some other physical state plays the same causal role in other organisms, for example, a different kind of neural state in the octopus, then that neural state will realize pain for the octopus. This is how the functionalist explains the multiple realization thesis that was the downfall of the psychoneural identity theory. Earlier, it was claimed that mental state kinds like pain can be exhibited by multiple different kinds of physical states and processes. According to the functionalist, this is because mental state kinds are defined by their function, and multiple different physical states can fulfill these functions. As I've said, there are many versions of functionalism, and some of them take the computer software analogy more seriously than others. In order to keep this video short, I will not go into the details of the various kinds of functionalism here. However, I do explore some of the options in the written version of this video, which I have linked to below. Instead of talking about the specific kinds of functionalism, let's skip ahead and now talk about the objections to functionalism. We have a general picture of what functionalism is, and that's enough for us to consider the objections to functionalism in general. Functionalism, in some version or another, is perhaps the most widely endorsed solution to the mind-body problem by philosophers and cognitive scientists today. Indeed, it is sometimes even said that it's the metaphysical foundation to cognitive science. For this reason, it is particularly important to study any problems that it may have. For if there are any insurmountable objections, then this would imply that there's something fundamentally wrong with the current approach to the scientific study of the mind. So, from now until the end of the video, we will look at 3 objections that have been raised against functionalism. The first objection concerns the holistic nature of the functionalist understanding of mental states. As we've seen, the functionalist characterizes each mental state in terms of its function in mediating between certain inputs and certain outputs. It's important to notice that for the functionalist, the defining inputs and outputs for any given mental state may include other mental states. The functionalist is not trying to explain each mental state purely in terms of its non-mental causes and effects. For example, pain is characterized, in part, by its propensity to cause distress and the desire to be rid of pain, each of which are mental states. Likewise, distress and the desire to be rid of pain will be characterized by their cause and effect relationship, and this may include additional mental states, and so on. The functionalist understanding of mental states is thus holistic. Each mental state is characterized by its relations to other mental states, and those other mental states are in turn characterized by their relations to other mental states. Thus, every mental state will be implicated in the characterization of every other mental state. Any given mental state, like pain, can only be understood by its relation to the whole range of mental states instantiated by an organism. This creates a fairly serious problem when we want to compare mental states across different kinds of organisms. For if mental states are characterized holistically, then it follows that two organisms can only share a common kind of mental state if they share every other kind of mental state. But that is highly unrealistic. Again, let's just consider pain. Intuitively, we think that pain is a mental state that can be shared by both humans and chickens. But we do not think that pain would have exactly the same causal role in humans and chickens, all things considered. Pain in humans can cause us the desire to visit a doctor or take pain medication. But pain does not cause these states in chickens. In all likelihood, chickens are not even capable of having the desire to visit a doctor or to take pain medication. But according to functionalism, pain just is the state that's characterized by its causal role. So if humans and chickens aren't capable of exactly the same causes and effects, for example, the desire to take pain medication, then it follows from the functionalist theory that they aren't capable of instantiating the same kind of mental state. Functionalism thus appears to entail that chickens or other non-human organisms aren't capable of the same kind of pain after all. There is actually a huge degree of irony in this objection. You may recall that functionalism was motivated first and foremost by the desire to explain the multiple realizability of mental states. The downfall of the psychoneural identity theory was supposed to be its inability to explain how both humans and the octopus can feel pain, and functionalism was supposed to save the day by explaining this fact. But according to this objection, it looks like functionalism has a difficult time explaining multiple realizability after all. That is, unless if it makes some modifications in how it understands the functional role of pain. I'm not going to say that this is a knockdown objection, but at the very least, the functionalist is going to have to modify how they understand the functional role of each mental state so that they can understand them as being shared across different kinds of organisms that have different total psychologies. Okay, let's move on to the next objection. Let's call this the Hive Mind objection. There are about 86 billion neurons in the human brain. Given the rate of population expansion, it is conceivable that there will be a time, not very long from now, when there will be this number of people. Imagine a world, then, that has 86 billion people. And now imagine that they all work together in concert and arrange themselves in a way that is that mirrors the arrangements of neurons in a brain. Finally, imagine that each person sends signals to their neighbors in a way that mimics the information being sent between neurons in a brain. If done properly, in perfect precision, it is possible that these 86 billion people could perfectly imitate the causal relations occurring between the neurons of a normal human brain. They would therefore mimic the causal relations that occur between sensory stimuli, brain states, and bodily responses. If they were to do this, would it follow that they collectively instantiate the same mental states as a human? Would the collection of all these actors constitute a hive mind? The philosopher Ned Block has proposed a thought experiment like this as an objection to functionalism. His intuition is that the hive mind would not have the full range of human mental states. Specifically, it's hard to believe, or at least it's highly unintuitive, that the hive mind would feel pain. Sure, there will be a group of actors that are recruited to imitate the function of human C fibers. And these actors would imitate the stimulation of C fibers in response to imitations of the causes of C fiber stimulation. And subsequently, further actors will imitate the effects of C fiber stimulation. So the causal pattern of C fiber stimulation in a normal brain would be perfectly preserved in the collective behavior of the hive mind. Therefore, there are states of the hive mind that play the same causal role that is associated with pain in humans. But does it follow that the hive mind would feel pain? There's some pull to think that it wouldn't, because after all, who would be the subject of the pain? Would it be the collection? Does that even make sense? Anyway, I'll just leave it to you to decide whether this is a compelling objection. The final objection to functionalism that I'd like to discuss pertains specifically to phenomenal mental states. These are the states that are intuitively characterized by what it's like to experience them. They have a particular feeling or sensation or qualitative character to them. Examples of phenomenal mental states include pain, pleasure, itching, seeing the color red, seeing the color green, and many others. The functionalist claims that these states, like all other states, are characterized by their role in mediating between certain causes and effects. So what it is for a state to be an instance of pain, recall, is just for it to be caused by bodily injury and other causes, and for it to cause typical pain behavior. But here's a problem. Ordinarily speaking, it would seem that the most essential feature of pain is not its causes and effects, but rather how it feels. The state of pain feels painful. It has a very recognizable qualitative feeling to it. And that's what appears to be essential to pain. If a state doesn't feel painful, then it simply isn't pain, even if it has the same causes and effects of pain. However, this highly intuitive thought goes against the claims of functionalism. The basic objection being raised here amounts to this. Each phenomenal mental state has both an associated feeling to it and its associated function. But it seems possible for the feeling and the function to come apart. That is, it is possible for there to be a state that has the feeling but not the function, and it's possible for there to be a state that has the function but not the feeling. In either case, we're inclined to think that each phenomenal state is tied with its feeling, not its function. Therefore, phenomenal states are not characterized by their function. One way to drive this point home is to consider the possibility of inverted color spectra. Have you ever wondered whether other people experience colors in exactly the same way as you do? When I look at something that is red, there's a particular experience of redness that is familiar to me. And no doubt, when you look at the same red object, you have a particular experience of redness that is familiar to you. We both call our experiences the experience of redness. But perhaps your experience of redness and my experience of redness are not the same. It's even possible to imagine that our internal experiences of color are opposite to each other's. Consider this possibility. When we both look at a red object, and we both call it red and say that we're having an experience of redness, the internal experience of color that I have is just like the internal experience that you have when you see something green. It's as if your red is my green and vice versa. Is this scenario possible? Of course, we could never know whether there is such a thing as inverted color spectra. The way in which we experience colors is private to each individual. I cannot see from your point of view what colors look like to you, and you cannot see what colors look like to me. Nonetheless, it seems possible that there could exist two people in reality whose experience of colors are opposite to each other's. But if inverted color spectra are possible, if this scenario could be true, then that would pose another problem for functionalism. The reason for this is that two people with inverted color spectra will have different mental states. They have different color experiences, and yet their states will have exactly the same causes and effects. Let's say that two people with inverted color spectra both look at a red stoplight. Their visual system will each cause them to go into their own respective state, with one color phenomenology for one person and a different color phenomenology for the other person. Both of their states will then cause exactly the same responses. After all, their behavior may be indistinguishable if everything else is equal. Both of them will say that they saw a red stoplight and that they experienced the color red, and they will both press the brakes on their car and bring their cars to a stop. Their behavior would be the same. Thus, any two people with inverted color spectra will have distinct mental states that nonetheless share the same causal role. But then it follows that their mental states cannot be grouped together solely by their causal role. If that's the case, then functionalism, which seeks to group together mental states by their causal roles, is doing something wrong. If inverted color spectra are possible, then that proves that there's more to this kind of mental state, phenomenal mental states, besides their functional role within the cause and effect patterns in human psychology. And so that's the final objection, and I'll leave it there. As I said, I go into more details on some of the versions of functionalism on the written version of this, but just to keep this video short, I will stop it now.